Hello and good evening, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name's Claire and I work in the alumni team here at the University of Lincoln. I'm very excited to present tonight's guest speaker, Dr. Chris Headleand, who is Director of Teaching and Learning for the School of Computer Science here at the university. He's also a firm favourite with our students and our alumni. So tonight, Chris is going to talk about the various technologies used to implement visual movement in virtual reality games, along with potential player-related experience such as cybersickness. Chris is happy to take questions throughout the talk, so please do pop them in the chat, and as we go along, I'll ask those questions to Chris. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Chris Headleand.
Brilliant, thank you for having me. So yeah, thank you for that absolutely fantastic introduction. Not sure about firm favourite. I suppose it would depend on what time of the year you ask them. No, as mentioned, my role is I'm the school's director of teaching and learning computer science, which means I've kind of an oversight of what our programs do, and try and make sure that everything stays aligned with industry and current research, and that our students get the very best experience they can while they're with us at Lincoln. My research area is in virtual reality. I'm an active VR researcher, and I also develop VR games as a side venture. So this is where my research world and my teaching world and my industry world all collide. Cool. Should we start the talk?
I would. So yeah, let's get going. Let's hear everything that you've got to say.
Brilliant. Thank you. Sorry, by the way, if I cough or sneeze, please excuse me. My little boy just started nursery a week ago, and he was there all of 2 days before he caught the world's worst lurgy and spread it through the household. So hopefully we'll get through this without too much coughing, but we'll have to see how this goes.
Well, actually, I have to say that I'm in exactly the same boat because my little one caught something. She was off nursery last week. So, yeah, we had to go through the whole rigmarole of COVID testing, etc.
I don't know how nursery nurses aren't sick all the time. You know, they must have immune systems made of steel. So this is gliding through the matrix, movement modality in virtual reality. So a little bit about this title. So gliding through the matrix, for hopefully most people have seen at some point in the Matrix films, this idea of that you can plug yourself into a computer and be projected into a virtual world. Obviously that film had some rather dystopian overtones and undertones, but ultimately, you know, the kind of the technology behind that film is really what we're trying to approximate or get as close as we can to with virtual reality. We're trying to put people in a point in a virtual world in a way that they feel situated, embodied, engaged, and completely immersed in that experience. However, when we watch The Matrix, what we see people do. We see people walking around and acting and doing kung fu and interacting with that world physically, largely as they would in real life. Obviously, the Matrix had a slightly different take on that. What they didn't do is the way that we move through in games, which tends to be kind of static motion, gliding around a world. And that would look very weird in Matrix. So one of my pieces of research is actually looking at how we can improve movement and how we can make movement feel more natural. So how do we move in VR? As I mentioned, we typically use some sort of controller, some sort of interface, typically some sort of hand controller, and we move around by moving a little joystick or something like that. The movement isn't natural, and by natural, I mean if I move my legs in the physical world, I don't necessarily expect my legs to move in the virtual world. So the feeling, I don't feel necessarily like I'm walking. I sometimes feel like I'm sat in a vehicle moving around. So a little cough there. So one of the most common ways of moving when we first started with virtual reality about 5 years ago was the gamepad. Now, when I say started with virtual reality about 5 years ago, virtual reality has been around for quite some time. It's been around since the late 70s, early 80s. But it largely died down, went away, because the equipment was so big, so heavy, it wasn't really ready for commercial use. However, about 5-6 years ago, a new brand came on the scene called Oculus, and with that, a collaboration that released the Gear VR. And the Gear VR was a headset where you could put a mobile phone in. Looks a little bit like this. You could put your phone in the front, wear that, and using your phone's accelerometer, you could look around in the virtual space. Now, that was a game changer. It made everything a lot cheaper, made everything a lot more accessible. But again, although we had the phone, we had this interaction, we needed a way of moving. And the way that we did that originally was with gamepads. Now, the reason we went with gamepads is because we were familiar with them. We knew how they worked. We've used them before. We've used them in all kinds of games. They've been arguably the most popular way of interacting with the games out there. We see them right from the beginning. It is the most traditional form of controlling video games. It allows for really good freedom of movement. We have these little joysticks on there where we can turn, look up, down, move around, and it's configurable and adaptable to various scenarios. So you can use one of these for racing games. You can use one for an FPS, a shooter, a platform game. We can adapt the interface to match all these kind of different modalities, so there's different outputs of games, because they are so flexible and so adaptable. And they are so adaptable because they've evolved that way. They've evolved with the gameplay genre. When somebody like Xbox still develops a controller, they want that control to work with as many games as possible. They want it to be useful. However, although these were really popular at the beginning of virtual reality, they're now largely frowned upon. And this is because the way that they're designed, the way that we use them, can often lead to what we call cybersickness. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail down the line. But it comes down to this idea that instead of moving naturally in a way that feels like we should be moving, we are instead steering something with our thumb. And that almost feels like you're being pulled through a world. Now imagine for a second, and this is the best way I can imagine, talk about cybersickness, that you're stood on a moving dolly or you're sat on a wheelie chair. And instead of being able to walk, somebody's going to pull you around on a string. And you get that sense of being lurched and inertia. That will probably be all right for a little while, but after a while you start feeling quite sick. Cyber sickness feels very same. When you have weird forms of movement, it upsets you. It affects your sense of immersion in the game. We then have these things called representational controllers. Now, a representational controller is designed to resemble a real-world interface. So, for example, you're probably all familiar if you've been in a car or any kind of driven vehicle, you're familiar with a steering wheel. You know exactly what that steering wheel does. No one needs to tell you because you've seen it used so many times. You know if you turn that steering wheel left, whatever you're driving will turn to the left. If you turn it to the right, whatever you're driving will turn to the right. So what we do in virtual reality is we try and use hopefully as best as we can, we try and use a controller that represents a real-world interface. So for a car, we'll use a steering wheel. For a plane, we'll use a joystick. We wouldn't use a joystick with a car. We could. It has all the same functions. You can still turn it left. You can still turn it right. But it would feel weird. It wouldn't feel right. The other advantage that we have with this kind of controller is that when you're in virtual reality, the virtual hands that you see and what your physical hands are doing look the same, look and feel the same. If you turn to the right, you see virtual hands turning to the right. If you turn to the left, you see virtual hands turning to the left. So some have argued that these representational controllers actually can help move us towards less cybersickness because, and again, remember that my example of being pulled around on a chair, that feels wrong. It feels wrong to be pulled through a space. But if I have a wheel and I'm in a car, that adds to my sense of immersion. I'm seeing a wheel in virtuality. I'm holding a wheel in the real space. So that improves my immersion and potentially helps reduce my overall chances of getting cybersick. Cybersick I'm going to talk about quite a lot, just to give you an idea what cybersickness is. Imagine car sickness, motion sickness. It's very, very similar. When you're in virtual reality, you've walked around for a while. Some people get symptoms of cybersickness. Other people are fine, never have any problems at all. I think the record of somebody feeling really cybersick, in my department at least, we have a driving simulator. We've had somebody sat down, lasted all of 7 seconds before having to get out and be violently sick. I won't say who that is because alumni are watching and they might tease him. But 7 seconds before somebody was feeling violently ill, and 9 o'clock that night, so about 7 hours later, was still feeling quite violently ill. I've spent, I think the longest I've ever spent in virtuality was 7 hours non-stop without feeling cybersick. But I've been there so much, I've got my sea legs at the moment. I've got my legs for the Matrix. Motion controllers. This is the next evolution of control for. I'm sorry about that. So this is the next evolution of control for virtuality. A motion controller tracks a user's hands in the physical space. So as I move my hands around in the physical space, you can see that movement represented in the virtual space. It's a bit like a copycat system. If you remember the old copycat kind of sketchboards, where you draw on one side and you get an equivalent copy on the other side, that's what motion controllers are trying to do. So as I do this with my physical hand, holding one of these motion controllers, in virtuality, through that VR goggles, I see my virtual hand do exactly the same. And it's doing that because it's tracked in a number of ways. It's either by infrared or magnetic sensors, but we know where my hand is in the physical space. So all I have to do in the game is match the virtual hand to it. This gives us a load of options. Now you can see in this, hopefully, on the top of these, we also have very similar interfaces to our Xbox controller, our standard games controller. In fact, if I glued these two controllers together, you would see it would start looking very much like a standard games controller. So I can still do all the things I can do with the games controller. But in addition, I can move things around in the virtual space as well. Where to learn about 3D games? Is there a professional association? So yes, there's a few associations out there. In the UK, we've got the BGI, British Games Institute. We also have Tiger. And to a slightly different, but more all-encompassing the games, there's the computing industry. We have the BCS, the British Computer Society. Now, between the three of them, there is a level of professional representation. But to actually learn about games and how to develop games, a big part is kind of getting involved with people who are already doing it. There's loads of things like game jams and early gaming sessions, loads of YouTube tutorials. In fact, we have one about to start, which will be going out on YouTube, called the Danny and Ben Show, where they'll be going online and teaching people how to develop their first platformer game. So really, one of the best things if you want to learn how to develop 3D games is find a buddy, find somebody you can interact with who's also doing it, or maybe is a little bit further ahead than you. Get involved with those. Find if there's a local games developer meetup. These happen all across the countries where people who are interested in developing games get together and talk about their experiences. But start Google. There's loads of really useful content on YouTube. So yeah, the other advantage of these motion controllers is you can point, you can do things in the scene. So what I can do is I can use this to move via what we call teleportation. So I can point at an area in the environment, pull the trigger, and jump there, instantaneously. Now this has a load of advantages for cybersickness because we never actually have to show the visualization of movement. And one of the things that we know about cybersickness is the disconnect between seeing movement through the goggles, but not feeling it in your inner ear, your sotima sensory, which is kind of your skin, your touch senses. Not feeling that sensation of movement in your body, but seeing it through your eyes is one of the reasons that you get cybersick. So if we actually just jump to a space, we kind of avoid some of that and we can reduce that significantly. So VR movement. As a rule, I did a piece of research with one of my colleagues a few years ago now on how we kind of look at VR on how we look at VR movement and how we kind of interpret it and understand it. And we came up with these 4 general categories: turret systems, pilot systems, motion systems, and avatar systems. So different ways that we can move. And these are based on kind of 2 axes of freedom. So how much can we move around the virtual space, and how much physicality do we have? So how much does our virtual motion interact with our physical motion? So if I actually do start walking, like I would in the Matrix, if I feel my body walk, do I see my body walk in the virtual system? So turret systems were some of the very first VR games that we ever had. They are what they sound like. You know, if you think of a turret on top of a tank, it can rotate and it can look up and down. So turret systems basically just tracked. If I show you this headset, they just track this the movements this way, looking around to project to the user. And this led to some really interesting early games, which were called gaze shooters. Now, a gaze shooter was, if you've ever seen the X-Men, think of Cyclops with his laser beam eyes. A gaze shooter, you could look up, look down, and basically shoot in the direction that you were looking. And that's how the kind of games worked. Movement in the virtual space was limited to head rotations, so it had very low physicality. And both the user and their virtual representation were locked in a single location. So playing the game, you'd be sat in your chair in the physical space, and the virtual space, you would also be sat in a chair, or you'd be physically, virtually locked in one space. Pilot systems are a little bit different. In a pilot system, the user is still locked in a single location in their physical space, but their virtual representation is able to freely explore the environment. So the way this works is, and again, if I can draw your attention to these kind of platforms at the top, I'll explain what those are. A pilot system, think of being a pilot of a plane or a boat, or a driver of a car. You are sat stationary. You are just sat in that vehicle, and the vehicle is actually the thing that's doing movement. And your movement is just because you're sat there, because you're in it. Now, the way that pilot systems work is you are physically locked in that space. But like I talked about with the racing games earlier, you maybe have a steering wheel, maybe you have a joystick, but you can drive around that space. And that's what these people are doing in the top. So these motion simulation chairs, you are driving something, but you're in virtual reality. The other method is, and we call that a continuous system. The other system is a discrete system. So a discrete system, the user is able to hop or teleport around the environment. So again, you're still physically locked in one place, but you can jump between key reference points. In a motion system, this is where the kind of gold standard of virtual reality is at the moment. The user is locked with one physically defined space. So we sometimes call this room scale because you're locked into a room. But you're able to walk around inside it. So one of the advantages of these headsets, because they have accelerometers, because we can track them using sensors in the room, we can know where this is. And again, if I know where this is, I can match it in the virtual space. And again, because I can move my arms, I can move around, and I can interact with my hands. But as this picture kind of highlights, you do that within one locked physical space. Now, this is, like I say, this is the gold standard. This is where we are at the moment. The best virtual reality systems are room scale, for the most part, especially in the home consumer market. The problem they have is how accessible they are. Now, if you think about what I've just said, you need to do this in a room. Well, that also means you need to do it in a clear room. Why? Because you can't have coffee tables in the middle of the room that you may trip over while you're playing a video game, battling demons or whatever. You don't want to be able to trip over the coffee table, a chair, the dog, so you need a fairly open, empty space. Who has an empty room in their house? that is just not how people use buildings. We fill them with stuff. We fill them with chairs, beds, guitars, all kinds of things that we put in our house generally tend to make room scale VR quite difficult. So this is a relatively limited market that has a house that's big enough to have the space required to make room scale useful, but also a space that is so empty that you can actually engage and use that space effectively in room scale. Now, I said this is where we are at the moment. Where we're trying to get to is what we call avatar systems. Now, an avatar system, we're able to physically move around the environment as much as we want, and we're able to virtually move around the environment as much as we like, but we're also physically feeling like we're moving in the real world. Now, the common way that we're achieving this at the moment, but this is very much stress that this is cutting edge research and this is very much in a lab setting, is this system at the bottom. And this is what we call a two-dimensional treadmill. So what you can kind of nearly see in this GIF is that there's a track that goes over the top in one direction and also tracks that go side to side. Now, what that means is because I can orientate people in two axes, I can keep them slap bang in the middle of these sensor rings. So I can keep them in the middle of the room. So no matter where they walk, how they turn around, the treadmill will constantly keep them in the center. So in theory, you can go for a 10-mile walk, a march, walk around a building, but you will just stay locked in one physical location while feeling like you've moved quite a long way. The other way that we're looking at doing this, and this is, again, a piece of research at another institution, is with these kind of mobile 4-plate robots. So these are, I always think they look a bit like Roombas, the kind of robot vacuum cleaners. What they do is they adjust to create ground under your feet. So as you start walking in one direction, again, you can see in this, they're constantly keeping the user in the center of the room. And even now, as they're walking up some steps, the robots are trying to keep the user in the center. No matter where the user sends their foot, the robots adjust to make sure that there is always a robot underneath that person's foot ready to catch them. Again, this is another slight difficulty. It's a great system, it's a great idea, but it requires to be done on a very specific kind of floor because you need these robots to be able to move fast. And again, you need quite a lot of space. Hopefully you can see these take up quite a lot of space moving around. They do have an advantage though, is they can do steps. We can actually climb, we can go up inclines, which the two-dimensional treadmill can't do.
So sorry, Chris. I just obviously you've mentioned about accessibility for these, and again, thinking from a normal person point of view and the likelihood of being able to access some of this equipment. I mean, do you think that the accessibility really is one of the big limitations for the growth of VR? For your average person who doesn't have the space or the money to be able to afford the technology.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't think that'll limit the growth of VR. I don't think that'll limit the growth of VR because VR will go in a very different direction. Well, for the moment. So VR is growing quite steadily. It's a fairly active market. It's a lot of players in that space. But this kind of stuff, this movement to more immersion, deeper immersion, it is limited by this accessibility issue. So, I mean, this treadmill at the bottom, this two-dimensional treadmill, you're not going to get much change out of kind of 50 grand to build a system like that. The robots, significantly more, and you would need a roboticist available to help set it up as well. These were expensive, and again, you still need less with the two-dimensional treadmill. The robots, you need a lot of space. Now, what the industry will do instead is we'll move to better and better desktop or what we call freeform mobile systems. So if I remember right at the beginning, I mentioned about the first kind of commercial VR headset was a mobile phone that you stuck in a case, basically. Those are getting better and better and better and better. So now the most popular VR headset is untethered from a desktop. So we're not attached to... Because this is the other side as well. When the Gear VR, the first kind of mobile headset came out, when Christmas came around and you're all sat around in the lounge eating Pringles and singing songs, you can be in your VR game, have a go, and it feels quite social because, you take it off and you go, here, Grandma, have a look at that. And everyone gets to, watch Grandma playing VR games. And it felt like a much more social kind of engagement because you could do this. There's quite a lot. It was really popular in certain countries. There's quite a lot of photos of people actually just taking their VR system on the bus. So instead of sat on the bus, you can stick your mobile phone in this headset, and you can be sat on the bus doing meditation exercises, for example. Meditation apps are really, really popular. And again, if you know that you've got a 20-minute bus ride, why not use that 20 minutes to sit and meditate? It was really, and there's loads of education apps in virtual reality as well. So it was open up new spaces that you could learn. But now those things can do the tracking as well. So untethered from my PC, I can walk around a room, I can see my hands, I can interact with objects in virtual reality. That is really where the industry is going at the moment. There is a sign that this stuff is starting to become a lot more accessible, though. And I'll talk about that in a slight future slide. But regardless, history kind of tells us with games, the more you kind of isolate it and the more you try and shove people off into their specific gaming rooms, the less popular they become. Big flight sim setups have been available for relatively affordable levels for about 15-ish years now. And it's still a very specialist piece of kit, and it hasn't really taken on, despite the number of people who play flight simulator games. And the reality is, it takes up a lot of space. Not many people have that much space to dedicate to games, but it also takes you away from society. It takes you away from your family, right? Compare the situation I was talking earlier about when you sat around at Christmas, you go, here, Grandma, try this. Now you have to invite Grandma up to your VR dungeon. And everyone's downstairs eating Pringles. Why did you want to come upstairs and muck around on your computer? It's very, very distant engagement. But again, there are some quite exciting pieces of technology that are coming out, which might change that a little bit.
Yeah.
I'll come on to that in a second.
Thank you.
But this is where the research is at the moment. I'll talk about some of the research I'm doing as well, which is motion simulation. So this is my research. I do a lot of work into motion simulation. Motion simulation is a bit of a misnomer, really, because we're using actual motion. But if anybody has seen these kiddie rides, usually outside of places like Tesco's and Sainsbury's, little car or whatever that just rocks backwards and forwards, toddlers love them. So the earliest motion simulation wasn't actually linked to virtual representation. You have that rock because it's supposed to make it feel like you're driving. It's supposed to make you feel like you're moving. Think of a carousel. A carousel spins round and round. It's a fancy roundabout. But put the horses moving up and down on cams as you're walking around, and suddenly it feels like you're riding a horse. Okay, so that additional piece of motion simulation, because it's not really a galloping horse, makes it feel like a more believable, more enjoyable engagement. Kiddie ride. There's the throat going. Kiddie rides, as I've got in this SpongeBob example, are some of the most common examples of motion simulation. And one of the earliest example was the Link Trainer in 1930s, which is a flight simulator. So back in the 1930s, before, this is when we were only just starting to even imagine what a computer could be. Alan Turing's very early work during the World War II. We were building motion simulated flight simulators. And the Link Trainer was literally, it had a tiny little plane model that was attached to baffles. And as you move the stick, the baffles changed to make it feel like you were pitching and rolling. And if you're really interested in seeing one, it's fantastic. It's fascinating. Really recommend it. You can come to Lincoln to have a look. Because at the am I allowed to plug other places? They're educational. It's got to be fine, right? So the Lincoln Air Museum at Newark, near the showground, they actually have an example of the Link trainer there, and that's amazing. It's a really rare piece of flight training and virtual reality. It really is just absolutely fantastic. So if you get the chance, go to the Air Museum, walk straight past the Vulcan. I know it's big and pretty. Go inside, find the Link trainer. It's really cool if you're a bit of a geek. So early games controllers. So if anybody's as old as I am, you'll remember how exciting it was when the N64 came out and the Rumble Pack came along. Now, the Rumble Pack was a vibrating extra that you clip to the bottom of your controller. Again, if you look at the picture, it's this thing with the N64 logo on it. And as you shot your gun in the game, the controller would vibrate to give you that tactile feedback of action. And actually, we used to use this to provide some physical indication of motion. So as we, say, for example, walked over cobbles, we could make the controller vibrate slightly. So it felt like going dug, 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 walking over cobbles. This was, at the time, so revolutionary. No one had really thought about putting tactile feedback in games before. It changed the world. Genuinely, the N64, there was I could give a whole lecture on the N64. There's so many innovations that came from those early days at, those kind of mid-90s days in Nintendo that really set the gaming world to where it is today. But for me, the Rumble Pack, absolutely amazing. And yeah, it was a very early form of motion simulation when it was used that way. So motion simulation, what it tries to do is uses real motion in the physical environment to simulate movement in the virtual space. So, for example, if you've ever been in a car and stepped on the accelerator a bit too quick, you feel yourself getting thrown back. If you brake a bit too heavy, you feel yourself flying forwards. Again, Newton's laws of motion, So what we can do in a motion simulator is we can try and simulate that to some approximation. So we know if somebody's accelerating forwards, we know there's going to be a force backwards. So we pitch the chair backwards slightly to make you feel like you're falling back into your chair. And as you brake, we tip the chair forward to tilt you, make you fall forwards because it feels like you're decelerating. And these will typically be aligned to a vehicle in the virtual space. So again, in this example on the yaw, somebody's driving a car simulator, and their motion in that chair will be linked to the motion of the car. So why bother? One of the reasons that we try and add additional motion to, and again, if you remember back to my, this is a pilot system. We were driving, is it can improve immersion. You're seeing movement, you're feeling movement, and that makes you feel like you're more immersed, more engaged in the virtual space. It can give physical cues, which are really useful in training simulations. So for years, I was a professional powerboat driver. One of the ways you learn to drive a boat, and again, if I used to do sailing and all kinds of stuff, but you learn to do a lot by feel. When you're in a powerboat, it's a really very specific example. As you accelerate to a certain point, the prop stops becoming efficient, and you can feel it chopping through the water because it's going too fast, and it's not driving the boat the same way that it does. You can't really see that. If you're out on open water, you can't perceive the speed in the same way because you haven't got the visual cues. You're not approaching stuff. It's very, very hard to know how actual fast and how efficient you're being. So you feel it. You can feel the prop skipping in the water. Now, if we have motion simulation, we can provide that cue so we can create a virtual powerboat simulation trainer, and we can give them that cue. Same if you're driving things like combine harvesters and stuff like that, that there are physical cues that you feel from going over the ground, that you know things have changed. Again, if anyone's ever done skid pan training in a car, if you've learned how to handle a skid, you do a lot of that through feel. The car, you're moving really quick. You feel what the car is doing. And again, in virtual reality, we can project what the image looks like, but we can't give the sense of feel. Motion simulation allows us to do that. So from a training perspective, incredibly useful.
We've got another question, Chris, which kind of talks about training. So what do you think about using gaming and VR in education? So obviously you just mentioned there about training. So for example, using virtual environments to create spaces where learners can see and hear native speakers.
Sure. So there's quite a lot of work going on in this area. So games, I use games in loads of education. It's one of my main areas of interest. It's something I talk about all over the place. Games are fantastic. And actually, this is a bit of a cheeky plug, and maybe somebody can chuck it up in the comments. But I did one of the early Lincoln Live Lounge virtual classroom things. I can't remember the name. One of the early ones I did with that was about how you can use games in education. And how you can use games in your own education practice. There's loads of stuff out there, but I do a much better job talking about it in that talk than I'll ever do here. So hopefully, Sam, if Sam can hear me in the green room backstage, maybe you can post a link. It's on the virtual classroom Facebook page.
Yeah, if we can't find it now, what we'll do is we'll pop it on after the talk. Yeah.
But VR. Is absolutely happening loads. So actually, one of my colleagues previously was actually working on a project working with interpreters and translators in virtual reality as a way of training people how to work in a translation environment. So if you've ever been in a meeting that's had a translator there, you have to run that meeting in a slightly different way to give the translator chance to interpret. And the way that translators are trained is actually quite resource intensive. You have to have a multitude of people in that space. It actually makes practice quite hard. So yes, that's one of the areas that's happening. Creating spaces where learners can hear and see native speakers. There's bits of this going on around there, and I think it's really, really interesting. We're also seeing things in augmented reality that are doing this. Virtual reality might not be the best, but again, this is one thing you've got to ask: what does a virtual reality add? We can see the environment. We can see we can change the way that people say, but you can do this kind of stuff where hearing native speakers through video links. And actually, one of the things that's been really interesting about lockdown is seeing all the creative ways that people have been doing live streaming and link ups to expose people actually culturally, probably broader than they've been exposed before, because they only have to go back 2 years where we were talking about shipping people all across the country, all across the world. Now, actually, people are a lot more comfortable. We've kind of been forced through this kind of international training on how to use the internet more effectively. And that's led to some really, really interesting opportunities. But yeah, VR games, my company actually develops which I won't plug, but my company actually develops a VR education app all about underwater and marine life, and how how to identify kind of and learning about marine life in its own environment, its virtual environment. But not everybody is equipped to go out scuba diving. So you can go in our app, you can go underwater and you can, that's a turtle and that's a clownfish. And so VR education, huge. So the one other way I would say that, so I talked about the training side. The one other thing that motion simulation seems to be really good at, and again, this is very early work, is helping to combat motion sickness. Because again, remember early on I said there's a disconnect between what you see and what you feel. So you see motion, you don't feel motion. And that's part of what we think makes people feel ill. Again, think about when you're in a car and you look down and reading a book or something like that. You're feeling the motion, but you're not seeing the motion. And that, because you've got a single focal point. And we know that tends to make people, if you don't get car sick, try reading a book in a car, as long as you're not driving. It's a good way of, getting car sick. Actually, don't do that. That sounds really terrible advice. Don't make yourself car sick. That is not endorsed by Dr. Chris Headleand.
If you do get car sick, are you much more likely, if you're going to give a VR game a go, are you much more likely to get cyber sickness if you tend to suffer with car sickness and things like that?
There is a correlation, but it also isn't completely aligned. So I know people who get very, very badly car sick. In fact, I know somebody who gets so badly car sick that they've had to sell their car. They go over on buses and trains because they literally couldn't get as far as the end of their road. I mean, it's quite a long road. They couldn't get as far as the end of their road in a car and not feel ill. Right. In VR, absolutely fine. I've also known people who get very, very, very bad. The person I mentioned earlier who lasted 7 seconds, and it was actually in exactly this chair, the one that's in the picture, this way. They got very, very sick in the chair, but they're very much into their cars. They like, they've done various driving events. They like driving particularly fast, and they don't get any kind of sickness in cars. But in virtual reality, very, very, very ill. So yes, there is a correlation. It's a good chance if you get car sick, you get motion sick easily, you're more likely to get cyber sick, but it's not the same. At least we don't think it is. But it does seem to combat it. Again, we're trying to almost trick the brain by giving it additional information. Okay, so you're not feeling it in your ear, but you are feeling this rock that kind of simulates what we're doing. The other side of this is it's fun. And we always kind of underplay the fun element, but these things are fun to have a go on. If anybody's ever had a go on a motion simulator, they are great fun. They make things more engaging. And again, if we're talking about back to training, and the earlier question about how do I feel about using games in VR from Rebecca, one of the things that makes games really good for learning, makes games really good for training, is because they are fun. It doesn't feel like work if you're learning through games, because people like playing games. Games are relatively universally enjoyed. It's rare that I met somebody who they might not like a specific type of game, but I've never met somebody who just dislikes all games. I mean, those would be people really lacking joy. So some of the grouchiest people I've ever met have still, their eyes have lit up when you've brought out a set of dominoes or whatever. Games are fun, and in the ideal world, education should be fun as well. I mean, we do loads of stuff to make education engaging, but games are a really good way. And I also think games are kind of their own reward. You're playing to learn, and you're learning to play. It's fantastic. So this is what a motion system can look like. So this is, we did a little TV series in School of Computer Science called Star in VR. For anyone seen Top Gear, it was kind of like a spoof of Star in a Reasonably Priced Car. And this is me driving an open-top race car in virtual reality for my episode. Particularly badly, I might add. Now, what you can probably see is I'm coming up to a corner now, and I'll start braking in a second. You'll probably see, there we go. So I started to brake and the chair tipped forward to give me that sense of you move, as the decelerates. And as you'll see as I go over I think I'm about to spin off any second now. It was kind of a dare. I had to do my lap in the snow. Wasn't fair. But I did spin off eventually. And as you'll see as I go over the grass, you'll see the car start juddering in the physical space again. So it gives me that sensory cue that something has gone not quite right. But again, at the moment, you can see as I'm changing gear, the acceleration of the car is changing slightly, and I brake and I tip forward, and you'll see again as I accelerate out the other side, the car tips back. See, it's tipping back there, and that's as I'm accelerating. So it's trying to give me the sense of motion. Now, I'll skip on forward before you see my terrible crash, because nobody wants to see me suck at driving a virtual car, especially when this is my research. So that system is relatively expensive. This system is a lot more expensive. This is the infinite rotation. It's a system that one of the debates I have with one of my PhD students is, at what point does motion simulation just become motion? At what point are we just replicating things so closely that it's not virtual anymore? And I think this is the example of when it stops. This is a massive hangar. It's a really big space. This is so what you can see at the top, this kind of capsule. It's kind of like a helmet, like a robot head. That's a pod where it's got 2 seats in. So that's big enough for 2 people to sit inside. And down at the bottom, it's on this movable track. So this can move backwards and forwards quite far. And it's on, I believe, an 8 or a 9 degrees of freedom motion arm. So this is a giant robot arm. This is huge. Arm stretched up high. This is probably about the same size as your standard 2-story house. And it's fully tracked virtual space. Use this for all kinds of flight simulators, driving simulators. And it costs a fortune. I don't even want to hesitate to guess. They don't publish the figures for this one. I don't even want to hesitate to guess at how much this costs. But it's not something I could, certainly not something I could install in my bedroom. It's very, very much not accessible. But even if we look at this chair, this is still a big chair. This is about the same size. It's about the same space as a standard 2-seater sofa. Who has the space of about a 2-seater sofa available for your fancy gaming chair? That's going to cost you about £15,000 to kit out. That is not accessible for the home user. And like I say, this one definitely isn't. You beyond needing a room, you now need a sizable barn and a very, very good credit rating. Now there are some cheaper consumer level products emerging, and a basic system can now be bought for just over £1,000. I'll show you a picture of this. I actually passed it earlier. Something any of my students will say. I bounce between slides all the time. So this is called the Your VR. Affectionately known to me and my PhD students as the salad spinner. It is basically a big bowl that sits on a bunch of wheels that rotate, tilt, and twist and spin. This costs about £1,000. It is very, very good. It's not quite as good as something like this. It's not quite as accurate. It doesn't have quite the same. You can't do quite the same level of alignment with it, but it is very, very good. It's about £1,000, which is about the same price as a consumer level, a high level consumer level gaming computer. So now this is something that actually is financially quite accessible. The big advantage with the VR, though, is how much space it takes. All this folds into itself. So this big green bowl that you can... I'm pointing at the screen with it on, which is useless. The big green bowl at the top that the person sat in, you take the grey bit off the bottom, and that sits inside that. So it goes in like nesting dolls. And then the bit where his feet are on, that folds up, clips inside, all fits into this very big salad bowl type thing. But it's small enough that it can be hidden under a table. You can tilt it on its side and it will slot in, by the side of a wardrobe quite happily. It's small enough that you can pack it away and get out when you want to use it. So you just move the coffee table, the dog, kids' toys. You can get out your salad spinning chair and you can play some VR games. And this is actually getting to the point where it's quite accessible. Still a pilot system and not this fully immersive avatar system I mentioned, but it's still really engaging, really interesting. So what we'd like to see, we've gone from this only came out really about 3 years ago now. So this is still fairly, 3-4 years ago. It's still a fairly young system, cost about 15 grand, to this, which cost about £1,000 last year. So we're getting a lot of movement very, very quickly in this space, and we can probably expect to see more, even more affordable or even more accessible systems coming out onto the market, and probably expect to see that in the next 3 to 4 years. So what else can we do? We talked about movements. I've shown you one way that we can simulate motion. So Claire, if you want to mute yourself.
Unmuted, here you go.
How are these people feeling that they're moving beyond their inner ear?
They look happy.
Yeah. But what's one thing that they have that I don't that might be an indication of their movement?
A car.
You're just trying to avoid
their hair moving. The movement of their hair.
Quite. I thought you were just being really nice and not commenting on my baldness.
Well, I wouldn't do that anyway, but...
So, yeah, we feel movement by the wind blowing through our hair. Movement, again, if we were to go in an open-top car and we were to race down the motorway, we'd feel the wind in our face, and that would give us a sense of movement. Now, this is something that we can do really easily in a lab. We can strap a giant fan in front of a chair, and when people drive in a virtual space, we can just blast them with air. Again, what we've shown is that actually does help people feel immersed. It does help people feel like they are really in the game. They're really in the virtual world. Virtual world. Sorry, the cold. So simulated wind can provide sense of motion. And like I say, it is like driving with a top down. And this does seem to, we have some early research that says this does tend to reduce cybersickness. Now, we haven't quite done we know there's a correlation. We don't know that the causation is there yet. For example, one thing that we do know is if you're feeling, sometimes you feel queasy, blowing some wind in your face, having a fan on can make you feel less queasy. So maybe what we're doing is counteracting the symptoms rather than dealing with the underlying cause. But what we can say from kind of variables that we've isolated and how we've looked into this in detail is that it makes people feel more immersed. And again, for the kind of stuff that we do, we don't necessarily mind too much why it's making people have less cyber sickness. We just know that it is making them have less cyber sickness. We also know it's making them feel more immersed, which is overall good. You know, it kind of makes training better. So this is the end of my talk. I think there's about 10 minutes left on the clock. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. I've thrown some stuff up on the board. I did a previous lecture on with one of my PhD students about this. The link is at the top. There's some papers. If anybody really looking for some bedtime reading, there's some papers on this kind of work. And yeah, if you want to get in touch, there's my email, cheadleand@lincoln.ac.uk. Thank you.
I've got a couple of questions, Chris. So do you think at some point that VR will take over the gaming world, so making traditional PC and console games redundant?
It's interesting. So it's likely that traditional consoles will be redundant in the next few years anyway. The way that research seems to be going is to what we call a cloud-based system. So, for example, if you wanted to watch a movie, let's go back 20 years. If you wanted to watch a movie that's just come out, you'd go to Blockbuster or the local video shop. You'd rent a film, you'd bring it home, you'd stick it in your DVD player, you'd watch it. Next day, you'd take it back. What would you do now?
Netflix or... Exactly.
You'd stream it. And people are starting to say, well, why can't we do the same with games? Why do I need to buy a physical copy of the game? Why do I need to download and take up all the space on my computer? Why can't I just play that, on the cloud? Why can't I stream it like the same way I do in Netflix? I don't need to download content from Netflix. And they've got a point. And that it is looking like that is the way that things are going to go over time. The challenge we have at the moment is not everybody has equal access to the internet. Internet speeds across not just our country, but all countries vary very significantly by locality. Traditionally, rural areas have lower speed internets. So we're not quite there yet. But consoles, I know the question is about VR, but the reason I would say consoles are probably not going to stand the test of time long term. So yeah, traditional PC console games, I think we'll see a big change in how that works anyway. The difference with VR is you can do a very different type of game. The 2D screen games, you need to design for that modality. You need to design for that kind of platform. Nobody would want to play, for example, a virtuality platformer game. Classic, how would you play Mario in virtuality? It just wouldn't work. VR is very good for very specific types of games, and actually, one thing that we have seen is, which is quite strange, we haven't actually seen much made. Most of the success stories in the VR gaming sector have not been big companies. They've been little independent outfits because they've been the ones who've wanted to experiment with the format and find out what works. And as such, some of the most popular VR games haven't been developed by big studios. They've been developed by independent artists. And we're starting to figure out what really works in VR. But it is different. It's definitely different to 2D games. So will it take over traditional PC and console games? No, probably not. It's too different. The mobile game is probably the fastest and most installed game out there. And again, nobody's going to want to play Candy Crush or whatever in virtuality. The mobile game will still have its place. Console games will still have their place. In the same way that console games didn't take over board games. In fact, one of the fastest, biggest resurgence going out there is board games. At the moment, there's lots of companies that are expecting board games to have such a boom after lockdown that they're making these massive stockpiles, like Fort Knox, just full of board games, because they think when we're fully out of lockdown, when all the restrictions are eased, everybody's going to want to go around to each other's house with box Pringles and play board games.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about COVID and lockdown and things, and it kind of made me start thinking about big kind of amusement parks and things, and roller coaster rides, and all the different rides and things that are there. And obviously, people haven't been able to do that during lockdown. Do you think as kind of VR becomes much more, if it does become more accessible to people, do you think people will want to get some of that kind of adrenaline rush and that kind of thing that they might have got from an amusement park in VR rather than physically going somewhere?
So actually one of the first kind of successes in virtual reality before we had commercial VR, back when things were still beta tests and stuff like that, was virtual reality roller coasters. Go back to that cybersickness, nothing will make you feel queasy like a virtual reality roller coaster. But yeah, they exist. But actually what we're seeing is people trying to get that adrenaline rush in different ways. One of the big kind of booms in virtual reality games for a while was horror games. Now horror games on PC are interesting. They can be quite, because they're interactive, they can be quite intimidating. In virtual reality, they are terrifying because of the sense of personal space. If I'm, my monitor is about an arm's length away from me here, and I know that's as close as anything can get to me. In virtual reality, it can be here. It can really invade your personal space, and it has got perceptual volume. It feels like it has physicality in that space. And having a virtual zombie come up that far from your face is just unsettling. It's unnerving, and yet it gets your adrenaline kicked right up. So that's what we're seeing more than things like virtual reality roller coasters, because virtual reality roller coasters are just unpleasant. They really, it's the only thing that can still occasionally get me feel cybersick.
Yeah. We've just got so Rebecca's just popped in the chat. What's your app that you mentioned called?
It's called Ocean Rift. So it's developed with a company I run with some colleagues, and it's an underwater adventure. It's an education game, and it was designed largely as a marine experience.
Fab. Well, thank you ever so much for tonight. And obviously you've got your email address up there, so I'm sure if anybody's got any questions, you'd be more than happy to pick those up.
By all means.
Wonderful. Well, thank you once again.
Thank you for having me.
And
always good fun.
I'm sure our alumni love to hear you, Chris. All right. Well, if we've got no more questions, then we'll say good evening.
Brilliant. Thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you.